The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles walked slowly through the corridors he had known since childhood. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a sound that seemed to match the heavy weight he carried in his heart. At 75, he had finally achieved the throne he had waited for his entire life, but the crown felt heavier than he had ever imagined. Charles paused before a portrait of his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. Her steady gaze seemed to follow him, and he wondered what she would think of the situation that now consumed his thoughts. The palace, once filled with the quiet dignity his mother had maintained for over 70 years, now buzzed with whispers and concerns that kept him awake at night. The trouble had started 3 months ago, just after the first anniversary of his coronation. What began as small suggestions from Camilla had grown into something much more concerning. It started innocently enough, recommendations about which charities should receive royal patronage, suggestions about staff changes, and ideas about modernizing certain traditions. Charles had welcomed her input at first, believing that her fresh perspective could help him navigate his new role. But, then, the requests became more specific, more personal, and more troubling. "Charles, darling," Camilla had said one evening as they sat in their private sitting room at Clarence House. "I've been thinking about the jewelry collection. Some of those pieces have been sitting in the vault for years without being worn. Perhaps we could loan them to my daughter Laura for special occasions? She has such important social events coming up." The suggestion had caught Charles off guard. The crown jewels and personal jewelry collection of the monarchy were not simply accessories to be borrowed for social gatherings. Each piece carried centuries of history, tradition, and significance that went far beyond their material value. These were symbols of the crown, held in trust for the nation and future generations. "The jewelry collection is quite complex, my dear," Charles had replied carefully. "There are protocols and traditions that govern how these pieces are used." Camilla's smile had remained fixed, but something flickered in her eyes. "Of course, I understand. I just thought, as queen consort, I might have some say in these matters. After all, I am part of the family now." That conversation had been the first of many. Over the following weeks, Camilla's suggestions became more frequent and more bold. She inquired about redecorating certain staterooms, suggested changes to the guest lists for important functions, and even proposed alterations to some of the palace's most cherished traditions. Charles found himself in an impossible position. He loved Camilla deeply and had fought long and hard for their marriage to be accepted by both the royal family and the public. She had stood by him through decades of scrutiny and criticism, and her support had been invaluable during his transition to the throne. But, now, her ambitions seemed to be growing beyond what was appropriate for her role. The situation reached a critical point when Charles discovered that Camilla had been meeting privately with palace administrators and staff members. She had been making inquiries about the management of royal properties, the allocation of royal funds, and even the procedures for accessing certain secured areas of the palace. When confronted, she claimed she was simply trying to better understand her role and responsibilities. "I want to be helpful, Charles," she had insisted. "I want to support you in every way possible. Surely learning about these things will make me a better queen consort." But Charles knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was being less than completely honest. He began to notice small changes around the palace, staff members who seemed nervous when he asked about their conversations with Camilla, documents that went missing briefly before reappearing, and security protocols that were questioned or challenged in subtle ways. The breaking point came when Charles received a confidential report from his most trusted advisor, Sir Edmund Hartwell. Edmund had served the royal family for over 30 years and had been one of Queen Elizabeth's most valued counselors. His loyalty was beyond question, and his discretion was legendary. "Your Majesty," Edmund had said during a private meeting in Charles's study, "I'm afraid I must bring a delicate matter to your attention. There have been some irregularities in the management of certain royal assets." Charles had felt his stomach tighten. What kind of irregularities? Requests have been made for access to documents regarding the ownership and management of various properties and investments. Additionally, there have been inquiries about the procedures for transferring certain assets. These requests have not come through the usual channels, and they bear the authorization of the Queen Consort. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had suspected that Camilla's interest in royal affairs had grown beyond normal curiosity, but this suggested something far more serious. Assets belonging to the crown were not personal property to be managed according to individual whims. They belonged to the institution of the monarchy and, ultimately, to the British people. What assets specifically? Charles had asked, though he dreaded the answer. Properties in Scotland, some of the investment portfolios established by Queen Elizabeth, and several collections of art and jewelry that have been in the royal family for generations. The requests suggest an intention to establish some form of family trust or to transfer ownership to ensure these assets remain within the immediate family. Charles felt the room spinning slightly. The implications were staggering. If Camilla was attempting to redirect royal assets for the benefit of her own family, it would constitute not just a breach of protocol but, potentially, a criminal act. More importantly, it would be a betrayal of everything the monarchy represented. "Are you certain about this information?" Charles had asked. "I have documentation, Your Majesty. I've also spoken with several department heads who have received these requests. They've been uncertain how to proceed, given that the requests appeared to have royal authorization." That night, Charles lay awake staring at the ceiling of their bedroom while Camilla slept peacefully beside him. He thought about their long relationship, the struggles they had faced together, and the love that had sustained them through so many difficulties. But he also thought about his duty as king, his responsibility to the crown, and his obligation to preserve the monarchy for future generations. The next morning, Charles began his own discreet investigation. He spoke privately with key staff members, reviewed security reports, and examined the financial records that Edmund had brought to his attention. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears and revealed the full scope of what appeared to be a carefully planned scheme. Camilla had been systematically gathering information about royal assets for months. She had used her position as queen consort to gain access to confidential documents and had been building a detailed understanding of how royal wealth was managed and controlled. More troubling still, she had been in contact with legal advisors and financial consultants who specialized in estate planning and asset protection. The evidence suggested that Camilla was preparing to establish a legal framework that would ensure significant portions of royal wealth would eventually pass to her children and grandchildren. While this might seem like natural family planning, the reality was that royal assets belonged to the crown, not to individual family members. They were held in trust for the nation and could not be treated as personal inheritance. Charles realized that he was facing the greatest crisis of his reign before it had barely begun. The woman he loved, the woman who had become his queen consort, was apparently attempting to manipulate the system for personal gain. The irony was not lost on him. After waiting his entire life to become king, he was now being undermined by the person closest to him. As he sat in his study that evening, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own challenges and controversies, Charles knew he had reached a moment that would define not just his reign but his legacy. The decisions he made in the coming days would determine whether the monarchy could weather this storm or whether it would be permanently damaged by the actions of someone within its very heart. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, and Charles understood that the most difficult part of being king was not the public ceremonies or state functions, it was the private moments when duty and love collided, forcing impossible choices that would echo through generations. Outside his window, London continued its eternal rhythm, unaware that their new king was grappling with a crisis that threatened to shake the very foundations of the institution he had sworn to protect and preserve. The real test of his character was just beginning, and Charles knew that everything he had worked for his entire life now hung in the balance. The palace, with its centuries of history and tradition, seemed to hold its breath as one of the most difficult chapters in royal history was about to unfold. In the silence of his study, King Charles began to plan his response to a betrayal that cut deeper than any public scandal or political crisis he had ever faced. The man who had waited 7 decades to wear the crown now faced the possibility that his reign might be remembered not for his achievements or vision, but for the personal tragedy that was unfolding within the very walls that were meant to protect and preserve the monarchy for future generations. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Charles had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, rehearsing words that he hoped would never need to be spoken. The evidence against Camilla was overwhelming, but his heart still hoped for some explanation that would make sense of everything he had discovered. He had arranged for them to meet in the Oak Room, a private space where they had shared many intimate conversations over the years. The irony of choosing this location for such a painful discussion was not lost on him, but Charles felt it was important to handle this matter away from the staff and security personnel who might overhear. Camilla arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, looking elegant in a navy blue dress that Charles had always admired. Her smile was warm and genuine, and, for a moment, Charles almost convinced himself that the documents and reports spread across his desk were somehow mistaken. "Good morning, darling," she said, moving to kiss his cheek as she always did. "You sounded rather serious on the phone. Is everything all right?" Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk, unable to return her kiss. The formality of the gesture seemed to alert Camilla that something was wrong, and her expression shifted from casual warmth to cautious concern. "Camilla, we need to discuss some matters that have come to my attention," Charles began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Sir Edmund has brought me some information that I find deeply troubling." He watched as her face went through a series of subtle changes, first confusion, then recognition, and, finally, a carefully controlled mask that he had rarely seen her wear. It was the expression of someone preparing for battle, and it confirmed his worst fears. "I'm not sure what you mean, Charles. What information?" Charles picked up the first document from the stack before him. "This is a request, bearing your authorization, for detailed financial records of the Duchy of Cornwall properties. This one requests access to the investment portfolios established by my mother during her reign. And this," he said, lifting a third document, "is correspondence with a legal firm specializing in estate planning and asset protection." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Camilla's hands remained folded in her lap, but Charles could see the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her nervousness. "Charles, I can explain all of this," she finally said, her voice taking on a tone he had heard her use during difficult public appearances. "As Queen Consort, I felt it was my responsibility to understand the full scope of royal assets and responsibilities. How can I properly support you if I don't understand these things?" "Understanding is one thing, Camilla. But this goes far beyond seeking information for educational purposes." Charles lifted another document. "This is a preliminary legal framework for establishing a family trust. The assets listed include properties, artwork, and jewelry collections that belong to the crown, not to us personally." For the first time, Camilla's composure cracked slightly. A flash of something, anger, perhaps, or frustration, crossed her features before she regained control. "Those assets will eventually need to be managed by someone, Charles. We're not getting any younger, and we have a responsibility to ensure that our family is provided for. Laura and Tom have their own futures to consider, and my grandchildren deserve security." The admission hit Charles like a physical blow. She wasn't denying her actions, she was justifying them. The woman he had loved for decades was calmly explaining why she felt entitled to redirect assets that belonged to the British people. "Our family?" Charles repeated slowly. "Camilla, those assets don't belong to our family. They belong to the crown. They're held in trust for the nation and for future monarchs. They cannot be treated as personal property to be distributed according to our wishes." Camilla's mask slipped further, revealing a hardness that Charles had only glimpsed in rare moments over the years. "Don't lecture me about the crown, Charles. I've spent years being treated as an outsider, being told what I can and cannot do, where I can and cannot go. I've earned my place in this family, and I refuse to watch my children and grandchildren be left with nothing while the institution takes everything." The words stung, but they also clarified something for Charles. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding of protocol. This was a calculated plan driven by resentment and a fundamental misunderstanding of what the monarchy represented. "Left with nothing?" Charles stood up, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "Camilla, your children have been provided for. They've benefited enormously from their connection to the royal family. But that doesn't entitle them to assets that belong to the crown." "Provided for with scraps," Camilla shot back, her own composure finally abandoning her completely. "Meanwhile, William and his children will inherit everything. My family will always be the outsiders, the second-class relations who are tolerated but never truly accepted. Charles felt the weight of revelation settle over him. This wasn't just about money or property, it was about recognition, status, and a deep-seated insecurity that had apparently been festering for years. Camilla had smiled and played her role as the supportive wife and queen consort, but underneath, she had been harboring resentments and ambitions that he had never fully understood. William will inherit the crown, Camilla, not personal wealth. He'll be king, with all the responsibilities and limitations that entails. The assets you're trying to claim don't belong to him personally any more than they belong to us. Easy words from someone who's never had to worry about being pushed aside, Camilla said bitterly. You've always known your place, your role, your future. Some of us have had to fight for every scrap of recognition we've received. The conversation continued for another hour, becoming increasingly painful as the full scope of Camilla's plan emerged. She had been working with legal advisors for months, building a case that certain assets could be classified as personal rather than crown property. She had identified paintings, jewelry pieces, and even some properties that she believed could be legally transferred to a family trust. More disturbing still, she had been cultivating relationships with key staff members, offering them positions and benefits in exchange for their cooperation and silence. The loyalty and discretion that had always been the backbone of royal service had been systematically undermined by someone within the royal family itself. Did you really think you could do this without being discovered? Charles asked at one point, genuinely puzzled by what seemed like a fundamental miscalculation. I thought you would understand, Camilla replied, and, for a moment, her voice carried a note of genuine hurt. I thought you loved me enough to want to protect my children's future. I thought after everything we've been through together, you would support me in this. It was perhaps the most painful moment of the entire confrontation. Charles realized that Camilla genuinely believed he should have been willing to compromise his oath as king for her personal agenda. She had expected his love for her to override his duty to the crown and the British people. I do love you, Camilla, Charles said quietly. But I cannot and will not allow the crown to be treated as a personal inheritance to be divided up according to our family preferences. That's not what it means to be king. The meeting ended with no resolution, only the clear understanding that their marriage had reached a crisis point that might prove insurmountable. Camilla left the oak room with her head held high, but Charles could see that she understood the severity of the situation. Over the following days, Charles met with his legal advisors, security chiefs, and most trusted counselors to determine the full extent of the damage and plan an appropriate response. What they discovered was even more troubling than he had initially realized. Camilla had not been working alone. Her son Tom had been involved in some of the legal consultations, and her daughter Laura had been identified as a potential beneficiary of the proposed trust arrangements. Some of Camilla's longtime friends and advisors had also been brought into the scheme, creating a network of people who were now aware of royal financial details that should have remained strictly confidential. The security implications were staggering. Information about royal assets, properties, and financial arrangements was now in the hands of people who had no official connection to the monarchy and no obligation to maintain the confidentiality that such information required. Sir Edmund delivered the most damaging news during a private briefing on Friday evening. Your Majesty, we've discovered that some preliminary transfers have already been made, he reported grimly. Several pieces from the private art collection have been moved to a storage facility under the management of a company owned by Tom Parker Bowles. Additionally, some jewelry pieces have been catalogued and photographed, ostensibly for insurance purposes, but the documentation has been shared with external appraisers. Charles felt his world shifting beneath him. What had begun as suspicious requests for information had escalated into actual movement of royal assets. The situation was no longer a matter of intent or planning, it was a criminal act that had already been set in motion. What are our options? Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. Legally, we have grounds for immediate action to recover the assets and prevent further transfers. However, given that the Queen Consort is involved, any legal proceedings would likely become public, with devastating consequences for the monarchy's reputation. Charles spent that weekend alone at Balmoral, walking the grounds that his mother had loved and trying to process the magnitude of the crisis he faced. The institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead was being undermined by the person who should have been his closest ally and strongest supporter. The decision he ultimately reached was perhaps the most difficult of his life, but it was also the clearest expression of his understanding of what it meant to be king. Personal feelings, no matter how deep, could not be allowed to compromise the integrity of the crown. On Monday morning, Charles returned to London with a plan that would either save his reign or destroy his marriage forever. The consequences would echo through the royal family for generations, but he had finally accepted that some choices could not be avoided, no matter how painful they might be. The emergency meeting was called for Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, before the palace staff began their regular duties. Charles had assembled his most trusted advisers, Sir Edmund Hartwell, the private secretary, Dame Margaret Richardson, the keeper of the Privy Purse, General Sir David Hawthorne, the head of royal security, and Lord Justice Harrison, the royal family's senior legal counsel. The group gathered in the throne room, a choice that Charles had made deliberately. The ornate chamber, with its gilded ceiling and ancient tapestries, served as a powerful reminder of the institution they were there to protect. The weight of centuries of tradition and responsibility filled the space, making the purpose of their meeting crystal clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice carrying the authority of his office despite the personal pain evident in his eyes, "we are facing an unprecedented crisis that threatens the very foundation of the monarchy. The actions we take today will determine whether the crown survives this challenge with its integrity intact." He outlined the situation with clinical precision, laying out the evidence of Camilla's systematic attempt to redirect royal assets for personal gain. The advisers listened in stunned silence as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. These were individuals who had dedicated their careers to serving the crown, and the idea that someone within the royal family itself could compromise the institution so completely was almost incomprehensible. Dame Margaret was the first to speak when Charles finished his presentation. "Your Majesty, the financial implications alone are staggering. But the damage to public trust could be irreparable if this information becomes public. The monarchy has spent decades rebuilding its reputation after previous scandals. Which is precisely why we must act decisively and completely," Lord Justice Harrison added. "Half measures or attempts at private resolution will only create more opportunities for this information to leak or for further damage to occur." General Hawthorne leaned forward, his expression grim. "Sir, we need to consider the security implications as well. The Queen Consort has had access to information about royal residences, security protocols, and movement schedules. That information has been shared with individuals outside our control." Charles nodded grimly. He had already considered these implications during his sleepless nights at Balmoral. "What are our immediate options?" "We need to secure all assets that may have been compromised," Dame Margaret replied. "Every piece of art, jewelry, or property that has been identified in the Queen Consort's documentation needs to be immediately secured and accounted for. We also need to change all security protocols that she may have had access to." Lord Justice Harrison consulted his notes. "Legally, we have several options. We can treat this as a purely internal matter and handle it through royal prerogative, or we can involve external authorities. Given the value of the assets involved and the potential for criminal charges, I would strongly recommend the latter." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Criminal charges against the Queen Consort would be unprecedented in modern royal history. The scandal would dominate headlines for months, potentially years, and would overshadow everything Charles hoped to accomplish during his reign. "There's another consideration," Sir Edmund said quietly. "We have evidence that some staff members may have been compromised. We need to determine who can still be trusted and who may have been influenced by offers of future employment or other benefits." Charles felt the magnitude of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about Camilla's actions, it was about a network of corruption that had spread throughout the palace itself. People he had trusted, staff members who had served the royal family for years, had potentially been turned against the institution they had sworn to serve. "I want all affected assets secured immediately," Charles decided. "Change all security protocols as of this moment. And I want a complete audit of every financial transaction, property transfer, or documentation request that has occurred over the past 6 months." "What about the Queen Consort, sir?" General Hawthorne asked. She currently has access to all royal residences and continues to participate in official functions. Her security detail reports to us, but they're not aware of the current situation. Charles closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. Effective immediately, the Queen Consort's access to all royal assets, properties, and confidential information is revoked. Her security clearance is suspended, and her official functions are cancelled until further notice. The silence that followed was deafening. In a few words, Charles had essentially ended Camilla's role as Queen Consort, stripping her of the privileges and responsibilities that came with her position. It was a decision that would reshape the monarchy and destroy his marriage, but it was also the only choice that preserved the integrity of the crown. "Sir," Dame Margaret said carefully, "the Queen Consort's private staff will need to be informed. They have access to her schedules, correspondence, and financial arrangements. We need to ensure that no further damage occurs. Bring me a list of everyone who has worked directly with the Queen Consort over the past year," Charles ordered. "I want to know who knew what and when they knew it." The investigation that followed was unlike anything in modern royal history. Teams of auditors, security experts, and legal professionals descended upon the palace, methodically examining every aspect of royal asset management and security protocols. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had been months in the making. Camilla had indeed been cultivating relationships with key staff members, offering them positions in a private household she had been planning to establish after Charles's eventual death. She had promised significantly higher salaries, better benefits, and less restrictive working conditions than they currently enjoyed in royal service. Several staff members had already begun providing her with information that went far beyond what was appropriate for a queen consort to know. Details about the monarch's personal finances, security arrangements for other family members, and even confidential correspondence had been shared with someone who was now revealed to be working against the interests of the crown. The art collection theft was more extensive than initially realized. 17 paintings, including works by Canaletto and Gainsborough, had been moved to the storage facility. Additionally, 23 pieces of jewelry from the personal collection, including items that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth, were missing from their secure storage locations. Most disturbing of all, investigators discovered that Camilla had been in contact with foreign collectors and auction houses, apparently assessing the potential value of certain pieces in the international art market. The implication was clear: she had been preparing to sell royal treasures for personal profit. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and brutal. Charles met with Camilla one final time, this time with witnesses present to ensure that everything was properly documented. She arrived at the meeting expecting another private discussion but found herself facing a formal tribunal that included legal counsel and security officials. "Camilla," Charles began, his voice carrying none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to over their years together, "you are hereby stripped of all privileges and responsibilities associated with your role as Queen Consort. Your access to royal properties, assets, and confidential information is permanently revoked. You have 48 hours to return all royal property currently in your possession or under your control." The color drained from Camilla's face as she realized the full extent of what was happening. This wasn't a negotiation or an attempt at reconciliation, it was a formal punishment being imposed by the crown itself. "You cannot do this to me, Charles," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I am your wife. I am the Queen Consort of England." "You were the Queen Consort," Lord Justice Harrison corrected firmly. "Your actions have demonstrated that you are unfit to hold that position. The crown has the authority to revoke titles and privileges when they are abused." Camilla turned back to Charles, her eyes blazing with fury. "After everything we've been through together, you would humiliate me like this? You would destroy me publicly for trying to secure my family's future?" "You destroyed yourself, Camilla," Charles replied, his voice heavy with sadness but unwavering in its resolve. "You betrayed the trust of the crown, the British people, and me personally. The consequences of those actions cannot be avoided simply because we share a personal relationship." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. All stolen assets were recovered within 72 hours, with several items being retrieved from private storage facilities and one piece of jewelry found in Laura Parker Bowles's personal residence. The staff members who had been compromised were given the choice of immediate dismissal or cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Camilla's children found themselves in an impossible position. Tom Parker Bowles was questioned extensively about his knowledge of his mother's activities and his role in establishing the storage arrangements for the stolen artwork. Laura faced similar scrutiny regarding the jewelry found in her possession. Both ultimately cooperated with the investigation but were permanently banned from any future involvement in royal functions or events. The public announcement, when it came, was carefully worded to minimize damage to the monarchy while making clear that serious misconduct had occurred. The palace released a statement explaining that irregularities in the management of royal assets had been discovered and that appropriate measures had been taken to address the situation. Camilla was described as being temporarily relieved of her official duties pending a review of security protocols. The British press, however, quickly sensed that something more significant had occurred. Reporters noticed that Camilla had not appeared at any public events for over a weekend, that her name had been removed from several upcoming official engagements. Speculation began immediately, with rumors ranging from illness to marital difficulties. Charles knew that the full truth would eventually emerge, but he hoped to control the narrative enough to preserve the monarchy's reputation. The institution had survived scandals before, and it would survive this one, but the personal cost to him was almost unbearable. As he sat in his private study that evening, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own challenges and crises, Charles realized that he had finally learned what it truly meant to be king. The crown came first, always and without exception. Personal relationships, no matter how deep or meaningful, could not be allowed to compromise the institution that served the British people. The hardest lesson of all was that wearing the crown meant accepting that some sacrifices could never be undone, and some prices could never be fully paid. The king who had once been a man in love was now simply a man who understood the weight of duty in its purest and most unforgiving form. 3 months after the crisis began, King Charles stood alone in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace, studying the empty frames where stolen paintings had once hung. The Canaletto cityscape and the Gainsborough portrait had been returned, but their temporary absence served as a permanent reminder of how close the monarchy had come to losing treasures that belonged to the nation. The palace felt different now, quieter somehow, despite being busier than ever. New security protocols meant additional staff, more documentation, and constant vigilance that had never been necessary when trust was simply assumed. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities that went back decades, built on traditions of loyalty and discretion that someone from within had systematically exploited. Charles's daily routine had been transformed completely. Where once he had shared breakfast conversations with Camilla about upcoming events and family matters, he now ate alone while reviewing security reports and audit findings. The personal cost of his decisions was something he felt every morning when he woke up to an empty bed and every evening when he returned to rooms that echoed with memories of a life that no longer existed. The public still didn't know the full extent of what had happened, but speculation had grown impossible to contain. Camilla's absence from official functions had stretched from days to weeks, and eventually to months. The palace's carefully crafted statements about temporary adjustments to responsibilities had fooled no one, least of all the experienced royal correspondents who understood that such language typically indicated far more serious problems than were being officially acknowledged. The breaking point came when a security guard at the storage facility where the stolen artwork had been kept decided to sell his story to a tabloid newspaper. Despite signing multiple confidentiality agreements, the guard provided detailed testimony about the movement of royal treasures and the involvement of Camilla's son in arranging the storage. The story exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in Britain and quickly spread to international media outlets. Queen Camilla's art heist screamed the headlines, accompanied by grainy photographs of the storage facility and detailed descriptions of the missing pieces. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and anger that someone in such a position of trust could abuse it so completely. Charles faced the most difficult decision of his reign, whether to continue trying to protect Camilla's reputation or to release the full truth and allow the justice system to take its course. The pressure from Parliament, the public, and even his own family was enormous. Prince William had privately urged his father to cut ties completely and focus on preserving the monarchy for future generations. The decision was ultimately made for him when Camilla's legal team announced that she would be challenging the palace's actions in court. Rather than accepting responsibility for her actions and working toward a private resolution, she had chosen to fight publicly for what she claimed were her legitimate rights as queen consort. The court case that followed was a spectacle unlike anything in modern royal history. For 6 weeks, the most intimate details of royal asset management, security protocols, and family dynamics were exposed to public scrutiny. Television cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but sketch artists and reporters provided minute-by-minute coverage of every testimony and revelation. Camilla's defense strategy was as shocking as her original crimes. Her legal team argued that as queen consort, she had inherent rights to manage royal assets for the benefit of the extended royal family. They claimed that the distinction between crown property and family property was outdated and that modern royalty required more flexibility in asset management. More damaging still, they painted Charles as a weak and indecisive ruler who was unable to modernize the monarchy or make difficult decisions about succession and inheritance. The defense suggested that Camilla had been forced to take independent action because Charles was unwilling to address the legitimate concerns of family members who would otherwise be left with no security for the future. Charles was forced to testify in his own defense, something no reigning monarch had ever done in a criminal proceeding. Sitting in the witness box, wearing a simple dark suit rather than any symbols of his royal office, he answered questions about his marriage, his family, and his understanding of his duties as king. "Your Majesty," Camilla's barrister asked during cross-examination, "is it your testimony that your wife never discussed her concerns about the future security of her children and grandchildren?" "She discussed many things with me," Charles replied carefully. "But there is a difference between expressing concerns and taking unauthorized actions to address those concerns." "Did you not, in fact, promise the defendant that her family would be provided for after your death?" Charles felt the weight of the question and the courtroom's attention. "I promised that her family would always be welcome and cared for within the royal family. I did not promise them ownership of crown assets that belonged to the British people." The testimony continued for 3 grueling days, during which every aspect of Charles and Camilla's relationship was dissected and analyzed. The public learned about their arguments, their financial arrangements, and their different views on what the monarchy should represent in the modern world. Perhaps the most damaging moment came when Camilla herself took the witness stand. Dressed elegantly but simply, she spoke with a composure that impressed observers but also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of her role and responsibilities. "I have given 15 years of my life to supporting Charles and the monarchy," she testified. "I have endured criticism, speculation, and judgment from people who never accepted our marriage. I have played my role perfectly, attending functions, cutting ribbons, and smiling for photographs. In return, I expected that my sacrifice would be acknowledged and that my family would have some security for the future." "When you say security," the prosecutor pressed, "you mean ownership of paintings worth millions of pounds and jewelry that has belonged to the crown for centuries?" "I mean recognition that the crown's assets should benefit the people who serve it most faithfully," Camilla replied. "My children and grandchildren have made sacrifices too. They deserve to benefit from their connection to the royal family." The response revealed the heart of the matter. Camilla genuinely believed that royal service entitled her family to compensation in the form of crown assets. She had never fully understood or accepted that the monarchy was a public institution rather than a private family business. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous, guilty on all charges of theft, conspiracy, and abuse of public trust. The judge, in passing sentence, spoke about the unique nature of the crime and the damage it had done to public confidence in the monarchy. "The defendant held a position of extraordinary trust and privilege," he said. "The abuse of that position represents not just a crime against property, but a betrayal of the British people who support the monarchy through their taxes and their faith in the institution's integrity." Camilla was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though she would serve only 8 months due to her age and lack of previous criminal history. More significantly, she was permanently stripped of all royal titles and privileges, her marriage to Charles was annulled, and she was banned from any future contact with working members of the royal family. The aftermath of the trial was almost as difficult as the crisis itself. Charles had to rebuild the monarchy's reputation while dealing with the personal devastation of losing the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. The institution had survived, but at enormous cost to his personal happiness and sense of trust. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some praised Charles for putting duty before personal loyalty and demonstrating that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. Others criticized him for the harshness of his response and questioned whether the monarchy was worth preserving if it required such personal sacrifices from its members. The investigation into staff loyalty had resulted in the dismissal of 12 employees and the implementation of new vetting procedures that made the palace feel more like a government building than a family home. The casual relationships and personal trust that had characterized royal service for generations had been replaced by formal protocols and constant monitoring. Charles found himself ruling over an institution that was more secure but also more isolated than ever before. The easy access and informal conversations that had allowed him to stay connected to his staff and advisors were now filtered through layers of security and verification that made spontaneous interaction almost impossible. The most profound change, however, was in Charles himself. The man who had once spoken passionately about bringing warmth and accessibility to the monarchy now understood that some distances could never be safely bridged. The crown required not just respect and loyalty, but a fundamental separation between the institution and the individuals who served it. 6 months after Camilla's conviction, Charles stood once again in the picture gallery, but this time he wasn't alone. Prince William had joined him for their weekly briefing on royal affairs, a tradition that had become both a practical necessity and a source of comfort for the king. The polls show that public confidence has stabilized, William reported, reviewing the latest survey data. 73% of respondents approve of how you handled the crisis, and support for the monarchy overall is back to pre-scandal levels. Charles nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. The numbers are encouraging, but I wonder about the cost. We've preserved the institution, but we've also changed it fundamentally. The warmth and personal connection that my mother brought to the role may no longer be possible. Perhaps, William replied carefully, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. The monarchy needs to be respected and trusted more than it needs to be loved. What you did demonstrated that the crown is bigger than any individual, including yourself. The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. William was acknowledging that his father had made the ultimate sacrifice for the monarchy. He had chosen the institution over his personal happiness, duty over love, and the future over the past. As they walked together through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, Charles reflected on the lessons of the past year. He had learned that being king meant more than wearing a crown or performing ceremonial functions. It meant being willing to make decisions that would be remembered long after the personal pain had faded. The monarchy would survive, as it had survived crises before, but it would be different. More careful, more distant, and perhaps more lonely. Charles had saved the crown, but in doing so, he had also learned that some prices could never be fully calculated until they had been paid in full. Outside the palace walls, London continued its eternal rhythm, and the British people went about their daily lives with renewed confidence in their ancient institutions. Inside those same walls, a king who had given up everything to preserve the crown for future generations continued the solitary work of ruling, carrying the weight of duty that only those who wear the crown can truly understand. The portraits of his ancestors no longer seemed to judge him from their gilded frames. Instead, they appeared to welcome him into their ranks, men and women who had also made impossible choices and paid prices that history would remember long after the personal cost had been forgotten. In the end, Charles had learned that being king meant belonging not to any individual or family, but to the timeless institution that served as a symbol of continuity and stability for millions of people who would never know the true cost of its preservation.